All right, so we're seeing hopefully a slide. All right, great. So we had talked, John and I had talked about, what to do for a presentation, and so we decided it'd be good for me to kind of look through. I certainly was familiar with the fact that Schroon Lake had a watershed management plan. And so we talked about the idea of having me go through and read the plan. And also there's an addendum that John shared with me that updates the plan. Read through that document, those documents, and think about or identify a topic or two where we had data to bring to bear on that might help inform and educate on the particular topic within the plan. So I did that. I read both the original plan and the addendum. Very impressive, first of all. Very impressive document, very data rich. I love history, a lot of great history in the document, so that was fun to read. I believe the plan really hits on the key issues, so the concerns, the issues in the watershed are very well, for the most part, very well described, as are the actions that you're taking to deal with the concerns. I was really happy to see in the addendum that you had identified terrestrial invasives and other things, and all the other lakes in the watershed besides Schroon Lake. So Paradox, etc. It's nice to see that the plan has grown and is so comprehensive. However, as I was reading it, I saw one area that is identified in the plan as a concern or an issue is road salt. And so we all know that road salt is an issue of some level in the Adirondacks. So the plan does identify it. It does describe a couple of actions related to use of salt in the watershed and concerns about the surface water. But there's very little, and this is no fault of the plan, there's very little data in the plan to support a real action related to road salt. There's some data, but not a compelling case of data made within the plan to support galvanizing action around the road salt issue. And so we actually just completed a study of groundwater, a regional study of groundwater throughout the Adirondacks that points to road salting as a serious concern, not so much for lakes, but for drinking water. So if you have a well, if you're on well water, and depending on where you're located, you may be drinking water that's not particularly healthy for you. So this is not addressed in the management plan. So what I want to do is address it tonight. So the topic is drinking water contamination by road salt. And so what I'm going to do is first talk a little bit about salt, what it is, why we use it, talk about the salt application on the road network within the Adirondacks, the association with salt runoff and our surface waters briefly. Then I'm going to move into our study of groundwater, share those results with you. And then I'm actually going to zoom in on Schroon Lake. So Schroon Lake watershed is included in our study, which was comprehensive in the Adirondacks. So I'm going to drill into Schroon Lake with the data that we have, talk about the results of contamination in the Schroon Lake watershed. And from that, end with a series of conclusions and recommendations to move forward that hopefully will be interesting and you may want to see some of these in another addendum, perhaps to your watershed management plan if you feel that these issues are of high enough concern. So that's the drill, if you will. And so again, questions, comments, post them into the discussion Q&A or in the chat. So first, what is salt? We say road salt, but what do we mean? Well, it's a mineral, a naturally occurring mineral called halite. Its chemical formula is sodium chloride, Na for sodium, Cl for chloride. It's the same salt we use, so that Morton salt or the generic version that you may buy that we use on our food. So it's the salt that we eat minus the iodine that's added. So we're all very familiar with it. It's a naturally occurring mineral, and just a fun fact, the largest salt mines in the world are actually located in the state of New York, in the Syracuse, Rochester area. So American rock salt is the world's largest producer of salt. It's mined from these are ancient seabeds. And if you're from the Syracuse area, you may remember that Syracuse used to be called the Salt City. And the Syracuse University, we're now called the Orgeman, used to be called the Saltine Warriors. So salt has a long history in New York still, and it's still a major employer industry. Salt mining is a major industry still in the southern tier region of New York State. Very large salt mines. So it's bagged up or put in trucks, and as we see, if you go to the local hardware store, maybe you're using salt on your driveway or your sidewalks, and the claim is correct on this bag. It melts ice and snow. So that's what we use for. So salt, road salt, is used as part of the operations for winter road management to make roads safe to drive on in the winter by either melting off ice and snow that may have accumulated, or preventing the accumulation of ice and snow to begin with by pre-applying salt before the storm. So when we add the salt, it melts. We get sodium, we get chloride melted, dissolved in water, and we call that salinization. So that salt builds up in the water over time, and the water gets saltier and saltier. Why do we use sodium chloride? We use it because it's cheap and effective. Both of these are in quotes. It's the cheapest chemical that we can use for de-icing. It's the only naturally occurring one. So we just mine it. All the other available chemicals are manufactured. So whenever you have to manufacture something, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, organic-based de-icers, there's an extra cost to manufacture. There's energy that has to go into that process. So it's cheap in that regard. And then it is effective at its job down to a certain temperature. So down to about 15 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, you have to start to use a lot more to get effective melting. So it is effective in a higher range of winter temperatures, if you will. I put these in quotes because when we think about the word cheap, we're not thinking about what are some of the potential costs that go beyond the purchase of the salt. We all drive cars that rust out, right? So that's not cheap for us. The bridges rust out, the rebar rusts out in the bridges and have to replace the abutments. There's these environmental costs, which I'm going to talk to you about tonight with drinking water. Is it really effective if you can't use it below a certain temperature? And we have pretty cold temperatures in the Adirondacks. But these are the general reasons why it is used. In terms of application on roads in the Adirondacks, we have 10,555 lane miles of paved roads in the Adirondacks on which salt is laid down in the wintertime. And lane mile, if you're not familiar with this term, 1 mile of a 2-lane road would have 2 lane miles, because if you're driving a salt truck, you're going 1 mile up and 1 mile back. So that's what we refer to as a lane mile. And I've divided these roads into 2 categories. The red roads, these are state highways. So that's our state highways like our Route 3s and 30s, US highways like Route 9, and then of course the interstate, which you're all familiar with in your watershed. Schroon Lake goes right down through it. So those are our state roads, and they're about 25% of our paved road network. The remaining 75% roughly are our local highways. These are about 725 lane miles, and these are local roads, county, town, local. The difference between these two is all the state roads are under the jurisdiction of the New York State Department of Transportation. So they're managed under their guidelines, versus all the local roads are managed on whatever the guidelines and levels of service are at the local level. So there's a big difference potentially in how these roads are managed, not only in the winter, but year round. On an annual basis, this entire network receives just under 193,000 tons of salt per year. And it breaks down to, so you look at this graph on the left, in black, was about 82,000 tons of salt are applied on the local road network, and the remaining 115,000 tons or so are applied to the state road network. If you take the total application amount, so this 82,000 divided by the lane miles, it gives you the application rate per mile. And when we do that, we see on a lane mile basis, the local road network receives just over 10 tons of salt per lane mile, and the state road network receives just under 40. It's about 38 tons of salt per lane mile. So the state, on average, uses about 2.5 times more salt per lane mile on its road network than what is put on the local roads. Why is that? Well, we all know that many of the local roads are not just salted, right? A lot of local roads are sanded, and that sand usually has salt in it, ranging from anywhere from 5 to 20%. Some local roads are salted, like state roads, but there's a lot of variability in how local roads are treated in the winter in terms of they use abrasives for traction rather than salt for just straight up de-icing, versus the state roads are all treated with de-icing chemical, sodium chloride, and New York State uses some of the highest application rates in the country. So that difference in that application rate on a lane mile basis is very important to remember when we look at the results. It's going to come into play when we see the differences in salt concentrations in our well network across the Adirondacks. So the process of salinization of our surface and groundwater begins with runoff. And we've all seen this. This is just an early spring picture. This is State Route 30, just north of where I am right now, Paul Smith's heading up towards Malone. So we're looking at about a 1 mile stretch of road. So this stretch would receive about 70 tons of salt per year. So imagine 70 tons of salt on this little stretch of road. And you can see the snow melt. You've all seen it. We have a melting event. So we just so happened to sample this one. So this is back in March of 2015. And the chloride concentration in this water was 5,000 parts per million. As a frame of reference, the chloride concentration in this water is 5,000 parts per million. As a frame of reference, the chloride concentration in water from a stream or groundwater in the backcountry where there's no roads is about 0.25 parts per million. So this is orders of magnitude more chloride than what's in nature. It's actually about 1/4 of the concentration of seawater. So this is a typical event, typical runoff event. So we have this water running, salt-laden water running off the road. In this case, heads downhill, right? Heads downhill. This is heading towards the Osgood River. In this case, it's in the Osgood River watershed. As it's heading towards the river, about half of that salt-laden water is going to infiltrate into the soil, where some of it will be stored in the soil and the remainder will make its way down in the groundwater. And the rest of it will actually end up directly into the surface water. So this process is going on throughout the region. So we take that 192,700 tons of salt runoff per year, spread across the Adirondacks. It's going through this process of melting off the road, moving downslope, some moving it, about half of it getting into the soil and groundwater, the rest of it running straight off into the surface water and out of the region. If we think of this number, Adirondacks salting became a widespread practice around 1980, time of our second Winter Olympics, so about 40 years ago. So that would mean about 7,700,000 tons, 7,700,000 tons of salt have been added to our roads in Adirondacks since 1980. It's a number that's kind of hard to put your mind around. So I like to make little calculations that maybe makes it fun or interesting. So this would be equivalent to 68,750 railroad cars full of salt. And that would be a train that would stretch from Paul Smith's, where I am now, 760 miles long, all the way down to Blacksburg, Virginia, where I went to graduate school. So I could ride the salt train. It wouldn't even have to move. So imagine a 760-mile long train worth of salt. That's how much salt has been brought into the Adirondacks over 40 years and applied to our road network. And of course, it's not there on the network. It has run off into the ground, into the soils in the ground, and then some of it straight off into the surface water. So that's a picture of the runoff sort of dynamics and how much is runoff. Here we're looking at the association between road runoff and our surface water network. So as I mentioned, water runs downhill. So we developed a model. So GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, just a computer tool, spatial tool that we use to build spatial models. And so we built a model that basically runs water off of roads. And we know roads are salted. So at some level, so the water that runs off of the road that connects with surface water means also that that surface water will have some level of salt or salinization to it. So when we do our modeling for the Adirondacks, About 52% of the, so all the red area you see on this map is water, surface water, streams and lakes and ponds that actually receive surface water runoff from paved roads. So 6,000 miles of streams in the Adirondacks, or 52% of the total length of streams in the Adirondacks, receives runoff directly from paved roads. About 195,000 acres of lakes, not including Lake Champlain, Lake George, or Great Sagadaga, because those are kind of by themselves in terms of size. The 77% of the total area of lakes, or 820 water bodies. And Schroon Lake is one of these. So Schroon Lake, you can see I don't know if my cursor works, but right here, Schroon Lake is a lake that receives salt. No news to this group. We know you have state highways and interstate right through the watershed. Schroon Lake, based on our own analysis, is in the top 20% of concentrations in terms of sodium and chloride. So 80% of lakes in our, so we run the largest lake monitoring program in the region, about 88 lakes that we work with. And Schroon Lake has a higher salt concentration than 80% of the lakes that we work with. So we know it's receives road salt. So we have regional salinization of our surface waters by road salt. So and this is a well-known, well-documented fact. What about groundwater? So using the same data, what you're seeing on this graphic, the gray area, these are unconfined superficial aquifers. The Adirondacks has 16,000 square miles of aquifers that are unconfined. What this means is that they interact freely with the soils above. And as you know, for the most part, Adirondack soils are coarse, textured, sandy, rocky soils. Water moves down through them quite rapidly and quickly. So the interaction, it's very easy for the surface water in the soil to interact and move down and recharge these unconfined aquifers. Most of these unconfined aquifers are overlain by runoff from paved roads. You can see the network here, and I'm just going to zoom in. So just a local picture. So Saranac Lake is here. We're looking at Lake Placid over here, and Raybrook area is right here. The black lines, these are paved roads. All the red areas, see, that's surface runoff, water running downhill. And then you can see the gray area, these are aquifers. So it's easier to visualize. Anywhere there's an overlay of red over gray, there is going to be contaminated water percolating down through the soil and getting into groundwater and contaminating that groundwater at some level. Maybe it's a low level, maybe it's a high level, but it does happen just because you have that spatial connection between the surface and what's underneath. So given this association, do we have regional groundwater pollution? If we do, the impacts are profound. Certainly we care about our surface water deeply, but the impacts of groundwater contamination are perhaps even greater, because when we're talking about groundwater, this is where many people get their drinking water. So most people in the Adirondacks are on private wells. They're not on public water. So we have potential for human health concerns, be it too much sodium or perhaps leaching of metals like lead. We have direct expenses to homeowners who suffer from corrosion of their plumbing, their hot water heaters or dishwashers. They have to buy expensive reverse osmosis treatment systems to be able to use their water. So direct expenses to homeowners, so pocketbook issues. And if your groundwater is contaminated to a level where it's not useful, it's going to affect the value of your property. So these are tremendous potential impacts if we have groundwater pollution. So do we? So we conducted a private well study. And so we had 489 participants from across the Adirondacks. And what we did is we classified the wells that were sampled into 3 categories. We had 206 wells that did not receive any road runoff. These are roads that are uphill from the road. We had 126 wells that received local road runoff. These are downslope of our local roads. We call those local wells. We had 157 wells that received state road runoff. So they're downslope of our state highways, and we call those state. And this little map here is just a zoom in where you can see how we did a classification. So all the white areas on the map, this is uphill from the road. So they're not going to get road runoff. So they're classified as no road runoff. You can see the red state highway here. The pink is the runoff from that highway. So any well that's in that pink area is assigned state runoff. Then you see the black lines, these are local roads. The gray is the runoff from the local roads. So any well that's in the gray area is assigned local road runoff. So that's how we did the assigning. And then when we look at our distribution map, you can see we have wells from all over the park. So it's not just it's not just the northern Adirondacks or the southern, it's all over. So this is a regional data set, so we can look at potential for regional contamination of our groundwater or drinking water with salt. So we're just going to look at some simple results for sodium and chloride. Then we're going to talk about corrosion. So first we'll look at sodium, and we'll look at 3 parameters. First, we'll look at the median concentration of sodium. We'll look at the maximum concentration, and then we're going to look at the exceedance of what's called the guidance value. So sodium has a guidance value, what's called a guidance value of 20 parts per million, meaning wells that have sodium concentrations higher than this level. For folks that are on sodium restricted diets, so maybe you have hypertension or other health issues where your physician has restricted your sodium intake, those types of folks should not be drinking water with a sodium concentration higher than this value. If they are, they're putting their health at risk. It's called a guidance value because there's no, for private well owners, there's no legal limit here. So if you're on public water, so I live in the village of Saranac Lake, I'm on a public water supply. This is not a guidance value for the village. It's an actual legal threshold. So it is the standard. So if my village water is higher than 20 parts per million, there actually has to be action taken to notify me that it's too high, or the village has to do something to make it lower. So we just call it a guidance for private well owners. So looking first at the none. So these are wells that are located upslope from paved roads. The median concentration for sodium is 3 parts per million, or milligrams per liter. The maximum concentration observed is 17 parts per million. And we saw that 0%, so none of these values are above 20 parts per million. So none exceeded. 17 parts per million is an indicator of salt contamination in some of the wells that are located upslope and away from paved roads. It's easy to imagine that some of these homeowners may in fact be using salt on their driveways, on their sidewalks. Perhaps they have a failing septic system that's also an indicator of higher sodium in drinking water. Of a private well can be an indicator of a failing septic system too. So there's reasons why that may be higher. Looking at the wells that are located downslope of local roads, so receiving runoff from the local highway system, you see that the median sodium concentration is double that of wells located uphill, so 6 parts per million versus 3. See, the maximum concentration is quite a bit higher at 403 parts per million. And we had 20% of the wells located downslope of local roads actually exceeded the 20 part per million guidance value. Looking next at state, you see a much higher, big jump in the numbers. So we go from 3 to 10 times higher. So 33 parts per million is the median concentration for state. The maximum concentration observed was just under 2,000, so 1,917. In the majority, 64% of the wells located downslope of state highways exceeded the 20 parts per million guidance value. Looking next at chloride. Oops. You see here. I just minimize it. Looking next at chloride, same data. So median, maximum, and guidance. Chloride, the guidance value is actually quite a bit higher than sodium. It's 250 parts per million. This guidance value is based, unlike sodium, which is based on a health concern. The 250 part per million guidance value for chloride is based on aesthetics. So once your chloride concentration in your well water gets above 250, it's actually considered saline water by definition, and people don't like the taste. So it's an aesthetic value, not a health value. So looking at the chloride results, for the wells that are located uphill and away from paved roads, the median concentration is 1 part per million, actually a little bit less. The maximum concentration is 64 parts per million. And And so again, just like with sodium, we are seeing some salt contamination of some private wells located uphill and away from roads. And this is, again, either the salting practices by the homeowners or indicator of potential contamination by perhaps failing septic. But regardless, none of these wells exceeded the guidance value for chloride. Looking next at the local, we see a 8 times higher median, 8 parts per million. Maximum concentration is 380 parts per million, 390, excuse me. And 3% of the wells that receive local road runoff exceeded the guidance value. Looking next at state, a big jump, just like with sodium. 100 parts per million is the median, so 100 times higher chloride concentration than wells located upslope and away, and a lot higher than local. The maximum was 1,680 parts per million, and 29% of these wells exceeded the chloride guidance value. So we see market differences. And this goes, why do we have these differences? Goes back to the point I made at the beginning. And that is how these road networks are treated in the wintertime. So the ones that are upslope and away are not receiving inputs of road salt from the state or local government. Our local roads receive some salt mixed largely with sand. So versus the state roads get all salt at a high concentration. So that difference that we see, local slightly elevated in terms of the sodium chloride concentration, state very much elevated, reflects the differences in terms of how much salt is laid down in the wintertime on these different types of roads. So chloride, I want to talk a little bit more about chloride. So this 250 part per million guidance value is, again, about aesthetic. But we care about chloride more for its corrosive potential and the implications for its corrosion than its implications for the aesthetic. And it turns out that the corrosiveness of chloride happens at much lower concentrations than 250 parts per million. So let's talk a little bit about corrosion. So chloride corrosion is a very well-known phenomenon. Chloride has a very strong affinity for the surfaces of metals. So it attacks, physically attacks the surfaces and dissolves the surfaces and corrodes the surfaces of metals, causes pitting. We know our vehicles, my rusty vehicles are a testimony to that. Consequences of this corrosion are significant. Folks that have high chloride water often have to replace their hot water heaters. So we see a severely corroded hot water heater is going to have to be replaced. Dishwashers have to be replaced. Other plumbing fixtures have to be replaced because of corrosion. Bottom here, you can see a pipe that's corroded on the inside by chloride. Going to be released iron, it's going to release other metals into your water, changing the flavor. But also, if depending on the age of your plumbing system, if your plumbing was installed before the lead-free laws were passed in 1986, you have the potential to have harmful heavy metals like lead in your plumbing. So the corrosion is going to release those heavy metals into your drinking water, which is, of course, a great concern with lead contamination. The standard for lead is no lead. So looking at corrosion potential of the well water, I calculated the corrosion index, which is based on the concentrations of chloride, sulfate, and alkalinity. Alkalinity buffers the water, so that's going to reduce the corrosive power of chloride. So more alkaline waters, the less corrosive they're going to be. So we're going to look at the percent of wells in each type none, no road runoff, local road runoff, and state road runoff, and how corrosive the water is that was sampled from those wells. So looking first at non-corrosive well water, looking first at none, we see that 95% of the wells that were sampled that were upslope and away from paved roads had non-corrosive water. So corrosion is not a concern for 95% of the wells. For the wells that were downslope of local roads, about 70% of them had non-corrosive water. So corrosion not a concern for about 70% of wells receiving local road runoff. Not so for state. So only a little over 30% of the wells that were downslope of state roads had non-corrosive water, meaning the rest of them had corrosive water at some level. And this has to do with the chloride. We're looking at more chloride, higher corrosion. Corrosive water at its basic level, all three runoff types have some corrosive water. About 2.5% of the wells located upslope and away from paved roads have corrosive water. Again, there's some salt is being added through either homeowners adding it directly through failing septic systems, or it could be some geologic action going on, resulting in some level of corrosion. About 10% of the local wells have corrosive water, and then about 7 or 8% of the state wells have corrosive. The last category is highly corrosive water. So about, again, another 2.5% of the wells upslope and away have highly corrosive water. About 20% of the wells located downslope of local roads had highly corrosive water. And over 60% of the wells located downslope of state roads have highly corrosive water. So when you think about corrosion and its impacts on our plumbing, our hot water heaters, our dishwashers, potential, depending on the age of your plumbing, your infrastructure, when it was installed, does it have lead in your solder? Do you have lead in your pipes? That corrosive power of that water, because of the chloride that's been added through runoff into the state road system, and also a little bit in local roads, is a big cause for concern across the Adirondacks. Let's take a look at the distribution of these wells, and then we'll switch to Schroon. So here's the distribution of the wells that have sodium concentrations higher than 20 parts per million across the Adirondacks. So all those black dots you see, so you see a regional distribution of high sodium water. And the way this breaks down just follows that table I just showed you. Again, none of these are located upslope and away from paved roads. 28 of these wells, or 20%, were located downslope of our local road network. And 107 of these wells, or 64%, were located downslope of our state road network. Again, reflecting the practice of higher salt use, much higher salt use on the state road network compared to the local road network. Looking second at our corrosive water. So this is all those red dots are wells that had corrosive water. You can see it's a regional phenomenon. So regional contamination of people's drinking water via the practice of road salting. And how this breaks down, we do see that some of our wells upslope and away from paved roads, 5% or 10 wells sampled, do have corrosive water, but it's more rare than what roads that are receiving runoff. See that 41 wells located downslope of local roads, or 28% wells have a local road run, have corrosive water. And we had 117 state wells, or 68%, had corrosive water. So at the regional scale, the Adirondacks, corrosion is a huge issue, as is sodium contamination, particularly for folks that have wells downslope of state roads. So that's the regional picture. Now let's zoom in, a couple final slides, and zoom in and talk about Schroon, what we know about Schroon. So first, the road network, you're all familiar with it. Schroon Watershed has 397 lane miles of paved roads, almost a 50-50 split between state roads and local. So there's 196 lane miles of state highway, US highway, and the interstate, which bisects, almost splits the watershed in half, shown in red, and 201 lane miles of our local road network, shown in black, in the Schroon watershed. Annually, this network received 9,648 tons of salt, and 2,210 of this would be put on the local road network, and 7,438 is on the state road network. And this difference just reflecting, again, the practices, right? At the local level, the sand, it was some salt. For all the state roads, it's all salt. So that's being reflected in the differences here. If we do the math for 40 years, we're looking at 385,920 tons. And just for fun, that'd be 3,446 railroad cars, or a train that's 38 miles long, which would start a few miles north of the Schroon Lake watershed go all the way through the watershed down 87 and stick out a few miles south of the watershed. So all that salt being dumped in the watershed over 40 years. What about the wells that we sampled in the Schroon watershed? We actually had 24 wells that in the Schroon watershed that participated in our study. And of these 24, 13 received no road runoff. So these are none, the yellow color. 6 of them received local road runoff, and the black dots, local, and 5 of them received state road runoff in red. Real quick, the sodium concentration data for these. These results are going to mirror essentially what we saw at the regional level for the larger data set. Lowest concentration of sodium for the 13 wells is median, about 3 parts per million, just over 8 parts per million for wells receiving local road runoff, and about 13 parts per million for wells receiving state road runoff. So seeing that same pattern for this much smaller data set. Same thing for chloride, increases as we go from none to local to state. About 2 parts per million for chloride for wells not receiving road runoff, just under 12 for roads receiving local road runoff, and just over 25 for roads receiving state road runoff. Again, reflecting the practices, the differences in the practices of much higher salt utilization on the state roads versus the local roads. In terms of exceeding thresholds, we only had 2 wells that had sodium concentrations higher than 20 parts per million. One was one that received local road runoff, located near the shores of Schroon Lake, and the other was a well receiving state road runoff located near the shores of Paradox Lake. In terms of corrosive water, we had 2 wells that exceeded the corrosive water threshold. Both of these were wells receiving state road runoff. One was located near 87 and Route 9, an area that we would imagine would receive a lot of salt. And the other was this same well receiving road runoff, state road runoff near Paradox Lake. So the small data set, but similar results in terms of what we're seeing at the larger level. Now, in thinking about the Schroon Lake watershed as a whole and the potential risk for widespread contamination of folks' groundwater in the Schroon Lake watershed, and whether this is something you should be concerned about, what I did was to kind of get at that question is I got all the data, so you can get the data from the Office of Real Properties and all the private homeowners in the watershed, and mapped out the private well network. And so what I'm going to show you that, I'm going to show you that now. So within the Schroon Lake watershed, there are about 1,800 private wells. And I mapped them, I assigned them categories based on whether they receive, what type of road runoff they would receive based on their location with respect to roads. And good news is 1,129 of those don't receive road runoff, so that's good. But there are 403 that receive local road runoff and 270 that receive state road runoff. And a lot of the state ones are located along Route 9 and along the interstate. Something to think about here is, of this 1,802 wells, 66% of them, or 1,182 of the homes associated with these wells, were built before the passage of the Lead-Free Act in 1986. So unless these systems have been upgraded to new plumbing, there's a potential for lead, solder, and pipes in a lot of homes. 66% of homes in the watershed that are on private water. So that's a concern. Actually, the average age of the homes in this data set is like, our average year of construction is like 1960. So they're pretty old on average. And again, unless they've been upgraded, there's a lot of lead in the plumbing systems of these homes in the original plumbing and solder that was put in. In terms of breaking this number down, the 1,182, 700 of these wells are associated with homes that don't receive road runoff, so they are lower risk for corrosion and release of lead. Just under 300 receive local road runoff, so a significant portion of those are at risk because we do have some amount of corrosion potential with the local road runoff. 200 of these are associated with state road runoff, and as we saw in the larger data set, about 68% of the wells associated with state road runoff in general have corrosive water. So a large potential here for corrosive risk, and then also leaching of metals like lead, which are very, very dangerous. So if we look at this as a gradient, there's a lead leaching risk goes up as we go from roads up and wells up and away from roads to local roads to state roads. That risk of lead getting into people's drinking waters goes up and up and up, particularly for the homes, or exclusively actually for the homes that were built before 1986 and that haven't been updated. So in thinking about these results, have some conclusions and then some recommendations, and then we can close out with some questions. First, we know through our work that our drinking water through the Adirondacks that's downslope of roads, be it local or state, is contaminated by salt at some level. So we know that. We also know that contamination is highest for wells that are located downslope of state highways, because these are the roads that receive the most salt. We also know that many private wells exceed sodium guidelines and have highly corrosive water, particularly wells, again, that are located downslope of state highways. We know that corrosive water causes damage, hot water heaters, plumbing, dishwashers, etc. We also know that this, through Flint, Michigan, that lead may be leaching in older homes, and that's a direct threat to human health. And again, this is mainly associated with state roads. And we also know that wells in the Schroon watershed are also contaminated. A small sample size, but we know that we've seen similar results that we see in other watersheds. We would expect to, because of the similar, the geology of the Schroon watershed is similar to many in the Adirondacks. And in fact, we may expect higher in Schroon because of the existence of our own interstate, which gets a lot higher salt loading. Some conclusions here. So some recommendations. I would strongly recommend that so the Schroon watershed is undersampled. So we have a lot of data from other areas of the park. We have a much better understanding of the percentages of wells contaminated actually in the Saranac Lake region of the Adirondacks, in the Old Forge region. So considering conducting testing of private wells to better understand the risk associated with people drinking well water, particularly associated with wells downslope of state highways. I would also urge and recommend conducting a public awareness campaign to build awareness of the risk. I've found through our own work that not a lot of people know much about their wells. Few people ever get them tested. So many people don't even know where they are, don't know how deep they are. So building awareness, getting around and talking to people, urge them to have their wells tested, regularly know about the concerns about their health related to drinking well water, so we can make sure people are healthy. I would continue it. So in the management plan that you have does recommend adoption of low to no salt practices by local municipalities. Really urge ramping up that consideration and really get working together with municipalities on adopting low to no salt practices, and also certainly at the state level as well. And lastly, for folks that don't have a choice, installing water treatment systems like reverse osmosis systems that can remove the chloride to reduce the leaching potential, the corrosive potential of the water, and sulfate as well. And perhaps even, and this is something that's being done in certain parts of the Adirondacks, is extending public water supply systems. So, if Schroon, if there's a public water supply system locally that can be extended, or establishing new public water supply systems in areas where there's no chance of identifying, remediating people's wells, establishing those systems. So that's it, a lot. Hopefully you found it interesting. I felt this was something that would be of value to share, given the implications of these results, particularly for the health of people that are living in the Adirondacks and in all our watersheds. All right, so I'll close that off, and we can have some questions. I know we started a little bit late, so I know we're at the witching hour, but Heather, do you want to get a few questions to me?
Yeah, our first question is, do we plan on repeating our well sampling study that we did a few years ago?
Yeah, we would like to expand. So if you were one of the participants, we would actually like to, rather than, I guess when I think about repeat, I think about go to the same places. If you're saying repeat, like expand it, we would like to. The original study was more of that was a real grassroots effort. Yielded a lot of important information, but it was very costly in terms of a lot of volunteer time on it. So we would like to expand that work and make it available to more people. And actually, now that we know where a lot of the risk is, to make it more targeted, to try to sample more wells that are associated with road runoff. We know where those locations are because we can map them, but do a much more targeted and purposeful sampling of wells. So yeah, we would like to, long story short, we would like to repeat in terms of expand, particularly in places like Schroon, where that were undersampled compared to other places in the Adirondacks in the original survey.
The next question is, Schroon Lake turns over 2 to 3 times per year. Wouldn't that have a positive effect on salt concentrations?
For the lake, absolutely. So the lake is turning over, meaning it's basically flushing. It flushes itself 3 times a year. So the salt in the lake is being flushed out. The salt, so a lot of the, so that's good for the surface water. But what's happening with the wells, that's not the same. The same thing isn't happening underground. So groundwater, the turnover rate for groundwater is on the hundreds of thousands of years. So what that means is the salt, it takes centuries for the groundwater to flush. So that's why we see it accumulate in the groundwater versus flush out and stay lower in the surface water. But yeah, you're right. So given the high turnover rate of Schroon Lake, helps keep that lake, the salt concentration in the lake, which it's high in a relative way to other Adirondack lakes, but it's still low. And that flushing rate has a lot to do with that.
Next question is, could uphill wells have downhill aquifers?
Yes, yeah. So an uphill well could have a downhill aquifer. So it depends on how deep you drill, right? So and it could be, it's a great question, and it could be when I talked about some of the uphill wells having higher concentrations of sodium chloride. Another explanation could be that well tapped into an aquifer that's actually low. One thing that's, so they drilled really deep. One thing that was interesting from our work, we had a survey that we actually asked the participants to participate in the survey, and that we asked them a bunch of questions. When was your well drilled? How deep is your well? What kind of aquifer does it tap into? What kind of treatment systems are you using? About half of the participants couldn't answer most of those questions. So that goes back to my point about doing a campaign to build awareness of the wells. But yeah, it certainly could happen if you drill really deep, and depending on if it's more gentle topography, you could tap into contaminated water even though you're upslope from the road. Great question.
Someone said, my house was built in 1980 with copper pipe. Would you replace the plumbing now with lead-free solder?
I would have it tested first. So the standard test. So what you do is we do what's called a static test. So in the morning, so the water's been sitting in your pipes all night. And so if that water is corrosive, it's going to be leaching out the heavy metals like lead, and they're going to accumulate in that water. And so we do a static test in the morning. You turn on your tap. This is assuming you're not running your water through a treatment system. You sample that water first flush, and then you let it run for 5 to 10 minutes, flush out the pipes, and you sample it again. And so that first sample is going to tell you whether you actually have leaching, any lead or other metals leaching in your water. The second one's going to tell you whether or not you're able to manage it by flushing it out. And so if you're able to run your taps for a period of time and flush that contamination out, you may still be able to drink your water. You may not, depending on how severe it is. And you may not want to always have to run your taps for 5 minutes either. But so I would have it tested. I should have said beforehand. Also, it depends on where your well is. If your well is down, know that you're downslope of a paved road that's salted, then you should absolutely get it tested. If you're not associated with the road, you're uphill and away, and you have some knowledge about the depth of your well, then you're probably fine. But I'm happy to talk to anybody offline too that has specific questions about this. It's what I care about very much. I want people to be safe.
How do we launch increased testing?
So I think that's a great question. I think as a association, I think so. You have a management plan. You have a steering committee. I think you may go through that kind of a vehicle to try to build awareness within the watershed. Maybe you work. Schroon is in the Hudson River watershed, so it's not eligible for funding from the Lake Champlain Basin program, unfortunately. But I think convening your steering group and talking about this issue and how you could come together with Soil and Water or other organizations to identify a funding source, and then using your networks within the Lake Associations, Paradox, Schroon, others, Brant, to build awareness of the issue, and then get folks to participate. So I think it's a grassroots, start at the grassroots level like we did, but then try to, I think, use the power of the organization you have through the Schroon Lake Management Plan and Watershed Management Plan to try to move forward.
What sodium and chloride numbers would you be concerned with in regards to the fishery?
It's a great question, and a really not an easy one to answer. So I can speak a little bit about the chloride, because there's been a little bit more work done there. And so first, direct impacts to the fish, the numbers would have to be very, very high. We're talking in the hundreds of thousands of parts per million in the lake. But if we're talking about the organisms that the fish feed on, so say that so phytoplankton, or rather zooplankton. So zooplankton have a sensitivity to chloride that may be down as low as 10 to 20 parts per million. And so we do see in studies that, so meaning that in water with chloride concentrations in the 10 to 20 part per million range have an impact on the reproduction and health of zooplankton, which of course are food for aquatic invertebrates, which of course are food for fish. So in the food chain of the fishery, if certain part of that food chain is impacted negatively by salt, that's going to by definition have impacts up through the food chain. But it's a great question, and the answer is not. It is complicated. But yeah, as low as 10 to 20 parts per million for zooplankton, but direct impacts on fish much higher.
Is the state using the minimum effective dose of salt on their roads, or could that be decreased in your opinion?
It's a great question. So the state is working to identify, so the state has been very receptive to all this information that we've produced over the years. They don't want to poison people's wells. They don't want to harm the lakes. So they've been working on reducing their application rates. And they actually have across the board. They've reduced them by about 25% across the board. One of the challenges, though, is salting. You could reduce the rate, but at the end of the day, the amount of salt that's put out on a given road is determined by Mother Nature. So meaning that you may have a low rate, but maybe we have a lot of icing events. So you have a low rate, but you go out 10 times more. So you actually put down more salt. So it's a challenge. So just thinking about the rate is only a piece. It's thinking about not only the rate, but what products we use, what technology we use, what should our expectations be in terms of the road and its drivability. Should we expect to be able to? And I've gotten used to be able to drive to work 65 miles an hour in February after a snowstorm. Should I really have that expectation, or should I maybe expect to have to take a little longer? So there are a number of elements to the answer, but they are reducing their rates, but because Mother Nature determines the actual amount, reducing the rate is only a piece of the puzzle in terms of trying to reduce the overall amount of salt that gets into our water.
Who can do a static test?
So you can, and I can send some information to John, and on who you can get a hold of to have that done. I'll do that.
I know some municipalities downstate are using beet juice as an alternative to salting roads. Is that practice going on in the Adirondacks? And if so, are there any concerns about this practice?
Yeah, so great question. So a lot of interest in using these byproducts. Beet juice is a popular one. Brewer, I can't even say brewery yeast. A couple of others. So anything that will dissolve in water will melt ice. So beet juice is a sugar. So that's being tried out. So it would go down as a brine, and salt is, and other practice with salting that's good to use less salt is actually use it as a brine versus a solid. So the concern with beet juice and these other organic byproducts is that they're food for microorganisms. So it's like giving like a McDonald's hamburger to these critters in the stream. So they're going to, when that beet juice runs off the road, which it will, and gets into the stream, which it does, it's going to really crank up the activity of the organisms in that water body. And when it does that, there's what's called biological oxygen demand. So the oxygen concentration decreases, and that can actually have unintended consequences in terms of the health of the fishery. Just like salt, sodium chloride has unintended consequences to the health of the fishery, like we're talking about before. These other products do too. So it's a question of, so yes, you could use these alternatives, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're better. They need to be evaluated, fully evaluated alongside what we're currently using now.
Did you know the depth of the wells you tested?
Depth, yes. So as I mentioned earlier, we sent out everyone that participated in our study tried to complete a survey, and about half of them successfully completed the whole survey. So for those that completed the survey, we know the depths, a wide range of depths, anywhere from what's called a point-driven well, which would be 6 to 8 feet deep. We had very few of those, and most of those, as you would imagine, were contaminated. all the way down. I think the deepest one was 1,200 feet down into confined aquifer and bedrock. Probably the average depth was in the 200 to 300 feet depth.
We have an uphill well that goes 450 feet deep. Does salt have an impact?
So I would say I would like to talk to this, like, know more about. It's hard for me to say. I think my answer from before, I think it could. It just depends on how high up, what's your elevation with respect to the road and with respect to the aquifer on the downhill slope of the road. If your well is down into the aquifer that's also associated with the road, then there's a potential for contamination. It just depends on that, what kind of slope gradient you're on and how high up in elevation you are away from the road and high up elevation you are away from the aquifer associated with the road. If your aquifer is confined, so if you're actually down in bedrock, it's unlikely, highly unlikely that would be contaminated because that flow, the bedrock aquifer flow, it's unlikely that you're going to get contamination in that system because they're talking about water flowing through cracks and void spaces in the bedrock. If your well is associated with an unconfined, say, gravel aquifer, then there's a greater potential.
The east side of Schroon Lake uses very little salt on the road. So what effect does Route 9 and Route 87 salt on the other side have?
Yeah, so I would hypothesize dramatic effects. Sorry, my phone rang. So the east side of Schroon Lake, some effects, right? Because my understanding that's a year-round paved roads, there would be some salt, but much less. But yeah, the western side where you have Interstate 87, which the actual application rates on the interstate are actually higher than the state highways. And so you've got Route 9 and the interstate both getting salted. The interstate even more frequently because they want to maintain a very high standard in terms of drivability. I would hypothesize that you would have significant contamination of wells in that drainage basin associated with the interstate and Route 9, much, much higher than anything you would see on the eastern side. Although we've only, as you saw on our map, we only had a few wells in that watershed, so we don't know, but we just based on what we do know about the salting practices and sort of the topography, lay of the land, we would expect. You saw on my map where there were all those wells associated with state highway. Most of them were along that corridor of Route 9 and the interstate.
What would a public awareness campaign about private wells address or cover?
Yeah, so I think that would be, first, reminding people that that they're drinking their water from the ground, and so they are relying on or assuming that water is safe to drink. Most people make that assumption, which is fine, but then they need to also understand that depending on where their well is located, they may actually be putting themselves at risk unknowingly to if they have health issues to too high sodium, or if they have no health issues and they have significant chloride and corrosive potential corrosion in their older home, they may be unwittingly subjecting themselves to lead poisoning. So I think a campaign will focus around reminding people that they're drinking well water, that water may be putting them in danger, that they should be aware of that. They should be aware that there's things that they can do. They should proactively get their water tested to see if they should take any kind of action. For example, install a reverse osmosis system to remove the sodium and chloride in a system that has older plumbing, for example. Or if there's a cluster of homes that are in a contaminated aquifer working together to actually plug into a municipal system if it's available. So I think the campaign is reminding people they're on their own water, reminding them that is unfortunately their responsibility, not the state's. Reminding them, cautioning them that they may be putting themselves at risk depending on the location of their well, and then advising them to have their water tested. So kind of those are the main points, I think.
Would AWI be willing to do a well test on residencies just around Schroon Lake?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and we actually, I think by virtue of our physical location here at Paul Smith's, we had a lot of participants just locally, like the Saranac chain and the St. Regis Lakes, all the Lake Clear, all around here. We have a really good solid data because it was, because I think of where we are, but we certainly would love to be able to work with the Schroon Lake folks and get a better understanding of what's going on down in your watershed. Happy to discuss that.
Great.
That was actually the last question.
Oh, okay. Well, I apologize for the time. It's 8:20. I hope folks found this valuable. I certainly enjoyed reading the management plan again. I think it's a wonderful document. And if there's any follow-up, so certainly this is recorded, and I will send John this information on getting tests, and I would be happy to meet with anybody from the association, East ESLA or the other Schroon Lake group or some group to talk more about well contamination and what could be done to address it within the context of your watershed management.